Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Tarek Dawoud, and this is Ramiro, and we are members of something called the Customer Success Team as part of the Identity Division. We are both architects on that team. It is a team that's part of engineering that goes out to customers and works with them on deploying identity solutions and learns from that. We've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, both of us. So with that, we wanted to share some learnings around the intersection between identity and access management as a discipline and developers, and some learnings we've seen along the way. With that, I actually, now that you know us, would like to know a little bit more about you guys. So, how many of you are identity architects? Ooh. Awesome. How many of you are security architects? Same people. Awesome. Interesting.
Hey, Matt.
How many of you are building architects? Should be none. You're in the wrong talk if you are. Now, how many of you are enterprise app developers within your organization? You're just developing apps for your company. Good. And then how many of you are app developers for ISVs, meaning you develop apps for other companies? We've got a few. And how many are LAN developers? None. Good. Still the wrong topic. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ramiro to lead it on.
Right, so what we're going to cover today is basically different pillars of our architecture of an application. Which one? Let's see, the clicker works.
Try the green one.
Try again. One. Oh, okay. Wrong button. Now, try again. Right, so what we're going to talk about here is the different pillars of the application architecture and bring you some additional considerations when we're looking at deploying those applications in the enterprise world. The first thing we're going to talk about is authentication, the authentication pillar. So we are all, especially in this room, and if not, I really would love to know why, single sign-on is goodness, right? So it's a great user experience for users not to be typing the password over and over again. But we're still seeing applications like this in the environment, right? So we have the long tail of applications that are still capturing users' credentials that do LDAP bind or AD directly log on as user, etc. And those have problems. And I just want to make sure that we are all aware of the risk that introduces. So we have to be very diligent about closing the gap on those applications that are not still in single sign-on, because the statistics, I don't want to repeat the keynote, but essentially the weak credentials are the best friends for the bad actors to go and try to compromise your application. So they are after these weak credential collection applications to either guess the password or, even worse, take a full dump of the database of the user ID and passwords, hopefully at least hashed, but that is how the breaches happen in the environment. And more importantly, 99% of the identity attacks can be mitigated by MFA. So at that point, if you are the owner of an application that's still in the credential collection business, you're missing out on hooking that innovation or capabilities, and we're talking about zero trust and further innovation. And if you are still in this world, then you're missing out and putting your organization at risk. So that is kind of the first principle that we want to share with you guys. You have to work together with the identity teams to make that happen. Now, another important thing when we talk about the human beings interacting with our applications, there are fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to make the right decisions. And this has all to do with us understanding the identity system that we have deployed in the enterprise. First question is, who are the human beings using my applications? The other question is, what is the level of interaction within the users in the application, and where those relationships are coming from or mastered from? So let's walk through some examples. We have Uber, right? So my function is to order a cab to get to the airport. I am a consumer. So for me, as a consumer, I need to be able to sign up myself into the application because I'm interested, and you guys do a great job selling the application to me, so I can log in as a user myself. But we have the other side of the equation, which is the Uber employees. So what are they going to do with my application? They need to pull reports of usage, help desk, support tickets, push code. So we have those personas in the environment, and that relationship with Uber comes from their employment. And that comes from the enterprise directory. So that is where you guys are architecting the application. How do you model those communities of users depending on the role in the organization? We have another example where we have Snapchat, right? Snapchat, again, application-oriented to consumers, but the collaboration between users is very high. So unlike the Uber case, I have use cases where I have to discover and enumerate users coming from the directory, as well as the ability to even share content organically. So that sharing space where I talk to my wife and my daughter to share like my picture with bunny ears, barfing, rainbows, etc. That part has to come, is basically within the application itself. There's no connotations in the enterprise for Snapchat employees to know what the collaboration space is looking like. Now we switch to the enterprise world where we have an e-learning solution. The communities that are interacting with that application are basically determined for my role in the organization. If I am an employee that needs to take compliance training of sorts, then my employment with the company is one driving that relationship. If I am a manager, then I need to see who from my team is lacking off and not getting up to speed with their training. So those relationships of who is a manager, who is an employee, and so on are coming from the enterprise directory. So in that scenario, you guys have to be able to model those relationships straight to the from the enterprise directory. If you are creating parallel data structures as developers to model what the employees are and what are the teams, then we are going to kind of in the way to interfere in the IT world. Now we have cases like Slack. Slack is an software as a service where you sell it to multiple people, and each customer has its own instance. So in that scenario, I have to take care of the distinction and separation of data between the multiple customers who are buying the instances of Slack. So you have to be able to interact with different directories and give the flexibility of to the administrators to configure the mappings that are specific to their environment. One interesting scenario here is that I am a Microsoft employee, and let's say we have our own instance of Slack, so I can log in and collaborate with my buddies in the Slack scenario. But then maybe my other customer, let's say Contoso Cars, just a random name, invite me to see their files. So you as an developer need to understand that I am a Microsoft employee, but I'm switching context to collaborate with the Contoso Slack space. So all these multi-tenant connotations need to be accounted for when you guys design your applications. So that takes care of the human interactions. So again, very important to understand the capabilities of the enterprise IAM system if your customers in order to model those relationships correctly in the architecture. Now, when we talk about non-humans, we need to obviously talk about a very modular architecture in a modern application. So the key here is to have a segregation or a granularity that allows us to have two things: least privilege as well as proper delegation. So the way we achieve that is being as granular as possible. So we have here a multi-tier architecture where you have web APIs and front ends and daemons, etc. And the key to granularity is that onboard each component of the IAM system individually. So Vittorio showed us in our talk earlier today, just curious, how many of you went to Vittorio's session, Introduction to Modern Authentication? Oh, Matthias?
Just right. Okay.
So in this scenario, we see that different identity IAM systems allow us to onboard client applications with the independent client IDs. Unfortunately, we're seeing in practice that applications start simply as a web app, and then we kind of augment the architecture and we add web APIs and other capabilities, but unfortunately, they reuse the same app ID, and that kills the granularity, the ability to set policies, the ability to govern, revoke, etc. So it's very important that you guys think about that as you layer your application and onboard them in a granular way. Continuing on that scenario, we need to the extent that we can, components that have the ability to hold secrets, we should be able to give them their own identity. So basically, we're talking about confidential client flows where you have client ID and client secret, or even better, a certificate. So in this scenario, we need to make sure that we can provide the IT pro or the infrastructure managers a way to say, this web API is receiving a call from this daemon, and this daemon proving that indeed that's the component that it's talking to. Another scenario here is, another granularity aspect is define the scopes on a way that we can grant least privilege. For example, here, you have a native app. Let's say I can read my information, but in order for me to write that information, I have to go to the web portal. So we can achieve that degree of granularity even if we have the same web API by defining separate scopes and granularly grant the scopes between this client, this native app client talking to this web API, or this web API having a different set of scopes. So that way we ensure that granularity, and it's important that we model that and utilize the capabilities of the IAM system to do that. So we talked about the authentication pillar in more detail. Now let's talk about the different options to choose the right scheme to authorize users. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is that depending on the use cases of my applications, that will determine the authorization scheme that I need. If I have a very trivial application like Uber, I am a consumer. By just me being able to authenticate, I have access to applications. So if I have to achieve the one task, and it's a one user community, by me authenticating, I just have access. So in that case, you don't have to worry about authorization in your code, and then all the tasks to determine who has access to your application is externalized to the IT world. And that's what we want to be. Simplicity is the key here, so you don't have to be in the business of creating authorization for that. Now, if we move to a scenario, which is probably where most enterprise applications are falling in, that we have specific tasks depending on the job functions or the responsibilities of the organizations, we need to provide whoops. How do I go back? There you go. So in that scenario, I need to communicate or publish in my application a definition of application roles and have an ability to read them back. So in this scenario, we are giving tools to the IT administrators how to map users and groups of users from the identity system back to my application. And in this scenario, I should be able to read that membership of the roles through claims in the token. Now, if the authorization is beyond the job functions and is also in the data plane, then we have to also think about what are the closest groups or the capabilities in my identity system that model that target of authorization in the data plane. For example, if I have a document in Box and I need to share it with the marketing team, the most likely source of truth to have that marketing team definition is in the identity system itself, in the enterprise. So let's be out of the way of creating our own definition of groups within the application if the target of that community of users is in the enterprise directory. In this scenario, we should spend our time trying to map that group membership in the directory into my application so that the IT provider has the responsibility of maintaining the group membership instead of our application. We also have another scenario where the authorization depends on my attributes as a user. For example, if I am coming from the United States, I may have a different travel policies than my colleagues coming from the UK. So in that scenario, if you are the writer or the developer of the travel app, you can be prepared to receive that information from the user as a claim if that attribute is in the directory, rather than maintaining in your own database. Lastly, we have a model based on consent, where the users themselves are driving what are they authorized to based on their level of interaction. So for example, if I am in a reading mode, I think probably my fitness pal is a good example where I start with basic information, tracking my meals, but if I want to start to track my macros, then I have to push a button to get the premium version, which is basically another way to authorize. So I sign up for that premium tier, and that has access to more functionality. So as I am consenting to more scopes on my application, the user is implicitly authorizing himself to do more activities. So based on that, we're going to switch gears, and Tarek is going to talk about governance and operations.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. So it's the green button, this one? Ramiro? This one or the big one?
Green one to continue.
Technique. So now we're going to switch real quick to talk about a couple of different aspects. One is how your app ties into the governance system, and the other one is a few operational considerations. So governance, real quick. Please play nice with the identity system. There are two things you can do. One is very lightweight, which is enabling some kind of JIT provisioning. So rather than requiring the owner of the app to always come to you with a CSV file and say, create these new profiles in the app, you could implement something that say the first time you see an identity token from the provider, you simply just-in-time provision. Now, sometimes your use case may require more complexity. You have to know the guy's manager and the guy's department before you give him any access. Fine. So that's the first one is JIT. Just making sure you guys are aware of it. Some of you probably know it, some of you don't. So it's an option you have for provisioning into the identity system. The problem with JIT is Hotel California. You come in, we never know that you left because we don't see your token anymore. But that doesn't mean you left the company. You're just not using the app. So you have no way of actually knowing that the guy left or changed departments or anything. So the one we want to recommend is the one that Alex Simons talked about in this morning's talk, Skim. So if you're writing an app today, especially if you're writing an app for an ISV app for other enterprises, but even if you're running for your own enterprise, if you can enable Skim in your application, if you're writing brand new code now with OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, you're doing all the right things, right? Then the next chapter after modern authentication is modern provisioning, which is this. So implement the Skim endpoint. It's a RESTful API. It's very cool. It allows the IDP to call you and drive you. Say, hey, remove this guy, add this guy, change this guy's role, put this guy in a group, take him out of a group. This way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, makes the IAM UI in your app much simpler. Simply plug me into your system and I'll just follow. Cool, so that's the biggest thing you can do to help with governance. The other thing is about logging. We'll talk about it in operations. So the first thing about operations is if you're writing an app for your enterprise or for other enterprises is make sure you make SSO integration a little bit easier. A lot of developers, what they will do is they will build one SSO connector, allow you to do SAML or OpenID Connect once, and that's it. What we're suggesting here is allow multiple IDPs. So even though the customer bought your app, they're just one customer, allow them to be able to migrate internally. Think of them, not just of you. So imagine they had ADFS, and they listened to Alex Simon's talk, and they said, we're going to move to Azure AD. Well, then they need to have old users on ADFS and a subset of users on Azure AD. How do they do that? If you have a restriction in your UI that says I can only allow one IDP. So if you consider supporting multiple IDPs in your app, so make their lives easier. The other one also to watch out for, we've seen some ISVs get it wrong, is they, in their code, have an enforcement that says if I see the same IDP twice, it's a problem, it's a bug, it can't happen. Well, that's usually because they have a prod version of your app and a dev version of your app. That's why you're seeing the same IDP twice, because they're configuring it against their production instance. Sorry. So be mindful of that as well. Don't put such restrictions. Allow this kind of flexibility where they can use the same IDP to configure two instances of your app. The second thing, which I think is, especially those of you who are security architects, is be aware of app secrets. App secrets used to not be such a big problem, maybe 5-10 years ago, and now it's a bigger problem. Back in the old good old world, when everything was inside the perimeter, you had a PKI service that was, dishing out certificates, and it was part of the infrastructure and change management, and you tracked who had what cert, and you gave it to the app owners, and that was it. Be aware that the story has kind of evolved from that. So if any of you got a chance, if you haven't, the link is here in the deck. This is the government's report on the Equifax hack. Nothing against the Equifax folks. This is about the fact that one of the main reasons the hack got much worse than it was is that a user compromise led to a finding of a file with app secrets. The app secrets were actually had the data, access to all the data that was stolen, not the user secrets. Okay, so you might think, well, this is the folks at Equifax. I'm better than them. Just letting you know, this is a real problem. So this is GitHub. This is me searching GitHub. This is actually a month ago for the beginnings of a certificate. And as you can see, this is 1 million hits. I'm not a member of these repos. Public repos all over the place that have certificates uploaded to them. So be aware of this. If you're not aware, your app developers may not know better. So keep an eye on it. Your senior developers should be aware of this, and the two of you should have a conversation on how are we managing our application secrets. And by the way, rolling back the repo doesn't help because you can always get the earlier version of the repo. You really need to purge the repo. So in this regard, there are two things you should think about. One is, what is your posture as an organization about provisioning the first secret? All of the major cloud providers have a way to provision the first secret. Azure has a way called Managed Identities. AWS has Credentials Manager. GCP has something else. But all of them have a way for you to get a secret at runtime. That should be the secret you use to go get the SQL connection string, to go get the certificate you need to talk to this other API. Right? So don't actually deploy a secret in the files that go into the code, because then you risk having it go to GitHub and all these other places. The second thing you can do is prevention. So going forward, stop putting secrets in the cloud by having tools. This is a tool from AWS that allows you to, when a check-in is happening, it scans for patterns of secrets and tries to block it. And then, of course, you already have existing depots out there already, even if you don't know it. So make sure to scan your existing depots, whether it's GitHub or ADO, Azure DevOps, or wherever you have code. And just make sure to scan it for secret patterns and purge them as well. This is basically on you now as the identity and security architects. Talk to your app architects. This has to be solved from an organizational perspective. Don't leave it up to the individual teams. Cool? And then logging. Make sure to log. The key thing here is across microservices, you should have some kind of correlation ID that you can track across the system, as well as the individual correlation IDs in each microservice. And if you get correlation IDs from the services you're calling, AWS, Azure AD, whatever, you gotta make sure you log it in your system. It is very difficult for us to find your stuff when you call and say, my app ID 123 called you between this and that, because there's 5,000 calls. When you give us a correlation ID, we can find exact transaction that caused the problem. Cool, so that's something you can do on your side. That will also make you play much better on the governance side with their SIM systems. They also can track things from an identity team and a governance team and security team. They can track transactions better if you have this better log. And with that, I'll hand you back to you, Ramiro, for wrap up.
The homework. So what are we going to do? First, enterprise applications don't get in the way. Don't implement things that the identity system is doing for you. Remember, from this talk, you don't have to be all around the bear. You have to be faster than the slower guy. The more that you take IAM functions on your own, the more slower you are, and you're probably the guy right behind the bear. So don't, or ahead of the bear. So don't be in that business. That means model user and component identities in a granular way so that you can model the right delegation between components. Also, right authentication flow, right flow for the job depending on the tiers of the application. We had a great deal of talks in this track about auth. So we have confidential client, public client, and all those flows. So make sure that you choose the right one based on your scenario and your tier. And also integrate user provisioning when you need to in order to get in sync with the source of truth, the enterprise directory, the consumer directory, whatever that may be. Please clean up. If you have code, is your public key, the SSH key in config files, or even worse in the source code, go and clean that up using the tools that Tarek gave you to detect those. And finally, please put the correlation ID or the traceability so we can find across multiple systems what was the right transaction that requires us investigation moving forward. So with that,
2 minutes.
We have...
Which is 2 minutes over, I guess. So,
no,
questions?
2 minutes to
Yes,
go.
sir.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys had an opinion on, in terms of doing... Sure. I was wondering if you guys have any opinion on, in terms of doing least privilege access for applications, for example, an API key. How would you guys think about modeling that? Would you put that application in a role, or would you limit the credential as the API key itself? Does that kind of make sense in terms of, like, am I restricting access on the application or the credential specifically, right?
So there's a deeper conversation to be had here, but I'm trying to get to the slide if I can make it eventually one day. The core tenet of the authorization slide here is, when we were mapping the app identities, is the fact that you need to make a decision as to, for example, this app can call as itself with full privilege. It can also call, there's a flow in OIDC and OAuth called on behalf of. So does this API need to know that this app is calling on behalf of someone else or not? That's the first question you need to ask, right? So if it doesn't need to know, then this guy can totally call with their own credential, a line credential flow, give me stuff. I need stuff, don't ask me, I'm the one deciding. You have to be careful with that flow, because then if a user is calling you somehow, they can trick you into getting stuff that they don't deserve. If they somehow can convince you to make the call, then you're calling as you and you're all powerful, correct? Yeah. So that's why, in OAuth 2, there's an on behalf of flow where basically you get a token for the user. Like let's say the web app over here, it has a token for the user, calls this API. This API is going to call this other API back there. Yeah. When it's calling that one, it can actually exchange the token that it received from here and say, give me a token to that one. This way, that API thinks he's calling. And it always can authorize based on his access to the data, not based on this super powerful API's access to the
Yeah, so then if we can avoid like a trust and subsystem model and actually flow the original caller identity whenever we can, that's definitely the way to go.
Cool.
Wonderful. And that was all the time we had. You did a fantastic job. It was very informative. Thank you, Tarek and Ramiro. Please. Thank you.